Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old. And today I'm talking about the new album from Clark, Sus Dog. Well, here we are with round 4 of me talking about Chris Clark. Check the description for my previous reviews on this guy. I assume most of us are familiar with him already. He's been putting out lots of solid efforts on Warp Records and elsewhere over multiple decades and continually reinvented his sound many times. If you want a starting point to get into him, I'd recommend hearing either his self-titled or Death Peak. I think those speak the most to the core of who he is as an artist and delivering a recognizable sound that only he could deliver in the way that he does. And the latter of those is almost certainly still my favorite from him overall. But he's made lots of other projects absolutely worth hearing, with lots of other interesting turns like the jazz-infused body riddle, the folk-infused iridelphic, the heavy and percussive turning dragon, and many others. Most recently, he's been self-releasing a bunch of modern classical-type projects through his own Throttle Records label and Deutsche Grammophon, and getting into some soundtrack work on the side as well. The modern classical stuff, while very nice and yet another interesting swerve for him, admittedly hasn't proven to have that much staying power with me. Projects like Kyrie Variations and Playground in a Lake were perfectly respectable for what they were, and were good if you wanted some especially dismal material, but they were obviously not easy listens, on top of being a bit hit and miss. And I haven't felt the urge to come back to either since covering them. But now he's got another new left hook to throw at his fans, what with his last 2 albums showing him delivering his own very light wordless vocals in a few spots. He's seen fit to make an entire album built around his vocals, featuring actual lyrics, repurposing his signature bombastic IDM style into this kind of alternative synth-pop kind of sound along the lines of an edgier and better textured version of more recent Apparat, or perhaps more accurately, the most electronic-heavy Radiohead albums or Thom Yorke solo projects. Incidentally, this entire project was executive produced by Thom Yorke, and he even contributes a vocal feature of his own on the track Medicine. I'm all for Clark continuing to experiment and try new things and push himself into unproven territory. Though I will admit, just like the modern classical turn, this was a turn that took a while for me to really warm up to. It took several listens for me to be able to pin down how I felt on any of this. After having sat with it for a while, I'll say this is a pretty solid project. I definitely enjoyed it more than either of his last 2 efforts, and honestly don't have that much to complain about as far as the execution goes. Clark proved that he had a pretty decent ear for synth-pop songwriting. He gave all these tracks solid tunes, and obviously lots of well-textured and decently varied instrumentals to back them up, living up to the level of production polish I'd want out of a new project from him. He's not even half bad as a singer either, despite spending the vast majority of the album in his falsetto range. He can get that to sound nice, and there is a somewhat delicate charm to it. I was never bothered by the sound of his voice, which is nice. With that said, while I think this project is very good, maybe even promising for if he chooses to continue in this direction later, I don't know if this ever clicks with me on like a deeper level or ever approached proper greatness. It's not an album that elicits much of anything in the way of like strong feelings or emotions in me beyond my respect for its construction. There feels like there's still more growing for Clark to do before he really nails this sound down all the way. I know I said I didn't mind Clark's voice and wasn't thrown off by him as much as I might have expected to be, although I think his presence might be the one element preventing this project from going all the way with me. Like, he's not bad as a singer, but he's not exactly like knocking it out of the park either. Thom Yorke having given him advice for how to incorporate his vocals and partially directing that aspect of the project does absolutely show, since more often than not, Clark singing just sounds like a low-budget version of Thom Yorke. He's also clearly still not comfortable behind the mic yet, and in one breath, that does thematically fit for the songwriting, which is about his own awkwardness and shyness, feelings of uncertainty, and yearning for a deeper sense of faith and trust. Ostensibly in the context of romantic relationships, but the whole thing feels like it's acting as like a meta-commentary for how he feels trying to make music in this particular style and moving in this new creative direction. Especially when Thom Yorke himself shows up to basically just tell Clark, "I know you have something to say, kid, just say it. You can build up the courage to say it." Sounds like a pretty direct parallel to what Yorke did for him in real life with this album, I guess. In that way, Clarke's obviously nervous and uncomfortable delivery throughout the project, again, fits for its subject matter. It's an album directly about his own nervousness and discomfort. Not to mention, as someone who once attempted a very similar move in my own music, to probably less successful results, I do absolutely empathize where he's coming from. I just don't really emotionally connect with it that strongly. He's only alright as a singer. His clear discomfort with singing puts a limit on how much passion he can put into his voice and ends up making him feel rather distant, which also put a limit on how deeply the material itself could resonate with me. But still, I have to respect the attempt and think a lot of it went over pretty well. Honestly, I don't even think I disliked any of the 12 tracks here. In terms of the regular synth-pop tracks, a lot of my favorite stuff is like right at the beginning. The album gets off to a particularly strong start with tracks like Alyosha and Town Crank delivering his own layered vocals over some especially propulsive analog synth and drum machine arrangements. Maybe feeling a little early 80s influenced, but also focusing on the same kinds of textures that we've heard Clarke use before on his best albums in the past, maintaining his own recognizable sonic fingerprint. And similar thoughts on a track like Dismissive, which didn't have nearly as memorable a tune, but carried the same level of energy. Clutch Pearlers is another nice highlight. That one's probably the happiest sounding track he's made, not just on this album, but just in general in like the better part of a decade. The breezy beatwork and light xylophone accompaniment on that one just feel really nice and pleasant in such a way that I'm not used to out of him, but that I'm very much welcome to. And the triumphant builds of Dolgach tape are very satisfying in a similar way. Though there are of course plenty more tracks which tend towards the moodier and bleaker. There's the title track, which shows him singing over a more stripped back instrumental made out of a light hip-hop beat and some pianos. He does hit some pretty ghostly high notes on that one, which are kind of impressive, I suppose. And on the other end of the vocal spectrum, you can get Bully, which shows the much bassier tone to his voice, carrying a bit of menace to it, and probably as the single catchiest and easiest to recall tune on the album, even if I don't know if it's one of my favorites. Like, that one's carried entirely by the core melody, but texturally leaves something to be desired. Now, while the second half of the album tends not to pull me in on average as much as the early stretch, it does end in two particularly striking highlights. The above-mentioned Medicine makes for a particularly disorienting drug trip-like climax to the album. There may not be any real hook to this one, but as his voice meanders through the strange psychedelic mix of synth blurs and slow but slightly overbearing jazz drumming, it creates this especially otherworldly feeling of being lost in your own head, I suppose. And Thom Yorke, once again showing up near the end to help guide Clarke through the darkness, is pretty cool. But I think Clarke delivers his best vocal performance on the album's closer, Ladder, which is nothing but a very sultry piano ballad that shows Clarke delivering his one repeating line about living on a ladder stuck between two floors, very earnestly and perfectly matching the dismal energy of the track behind him. Oh yeah, and of course in the middle of the album, almost as if to directly make someone like me happy, he included a bunch of instrumental cuts as well, which I very much appreciate. Especially when it comes to the dramatic piano buildups of Over Empty Streets and the analog synth melody excursions of Wedding. Both have really strong melodies and add some extra texture to this album that the whole thing very much benefits from. And there's also the half-instrumental Forest, which I'm less hot on. It's basically two unrelated ideas stuck together, with the first half being an abstract and formless pad of quiet noise, and the second half showing his vocals harmonizing with himself as if he was an entire barbershop quartet or something. It's fine, just not really a highlight. It was also the track I ended up arbitrarily picking as my least favorite. But yeah, that's everything on Sus Dog. Again, it's pretty solid. Good melodies, good production that delivers all the instrumental texture that I want out of a new Clarke album with or without his singing. And his singing is pretty decent, and again, as uncomfortable as he sounds, it does fit with the subject matter he chooses to focus the lyrics on. But it also kind of feels like a transitional effort for him, and doesn't quite feel like the fully formed version of itself yet. There's definitely some room for improvement here. This will either act as like a one-off detour in his catalog, never to be repeated again like the one time I made a vocal album, in which case it'll add to the depth and variety of his catalog and be an interesting novelty, if not a big essential standout among his other albums. Or he can end up further refining this sound he started with this album and use it as a platform to get to something even better later down the line. As it stands, while I don't think this is going to be like a year-end list contender or something I see myself coming back to a lot, Sus Dog is a very good album that shows a lot of promise, and I definitely enjoyed myself with it. If you're a fan of Clark, it'll probably be as worth hearing as anything else he's done. I'm overall feeling a 7.5 out of 10 on it. But of course, this is just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. Shout out to my Patreon supporters. They're awesome people. You want to add yourself to that list. Link to my Patreon is in the description. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time.